Hello, everybody. We are waiting for our Lyft crew to get on, but thank you all for joining us. Awesome. I see a lot of engagement right now. I'm very excited. Again, we're waiting for the Lyft crew to get on. There is Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no
I don't know
problem.
if you can see all the chat. Everyone is super excited right now.
Hi, everyone. Excited to chat with you.
Cool. We're going to wait for your team to get on.
I think they're having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to try to send them the link here.
Okay, awesome. I know everyone registered, so they're able to just hop on and share their audio and video. It takes a couple of seconds, a bit of a delay. I don't see Vivian on here. Oh,
Hi.
hello. All right, gonna do a quick roll call on the chat. Let us know where you are dialing in from, what school you guys are from, what city, what state, or even a country. Go ahead, I wanna see where everyone is coming from, if you can go ahead and chat that. Wow, Brunel University in London, UCSD, UW Seattle, Toronto. Oh my gosh, the chat is blowing up right now. This is awesome. Cool. We're just waiting on Vivian. Let's see. India. Oh, there it is. Sorry about that. Okay, everyone's accounted for? All right, we have 213 on the platform right now, 180 and climbing are viewing you. This is insane. Crazy. Thank you all for joining us for the URX Lyft event today. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Kathleen Murto, and I manage the Intern and New College Grad Program at Cloudera, and I am also a URX community leader. For those of you that don't know what URX is a community of early talent professionals. So we have university recruiters, and then we also have career service folks. We meet frequently to kind of share best practices and host events like this for our students. I am going to kick it off to Vivian. I'm going to hop off, and I'm going to leave it to you guys. All right? All right, bye.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're really excited to have you all here. Thank you to the URX Talent Development Program for hosting us and inviting us to join this panel. We have a lot of great content to share with everyone. I know that this is something that I personally get a lot of requests for, is doing a design workshop or a design talk. So we're all very happy to be here and to share a lot of our learnings. So I think we'll do a quick round of intros before we get started. I'm Vivian. I'm part of the university programs team at Lyft. I'm a university recruiter here, which means I kind of wear a lot of hats with recruiting and developing programs and working with our interns when they are here during the seasons. We have a lot of interns here with us during the summer. So yeah, it's an exciting job, and I get to work with our great designers, writers, and researchers like Yudi, Stephanie, and Jeannie. So love my job. Fun fact is I'm very obsessed with food. I probably take more pictures of food than I do of people. My Instagram, my Facebook, everything is like all food based. So that's me. And then I think I'll start with whoever's at the top in my chart. Yudi.
Everyone, my name is Yudi. I'm a product designer on our driver team. I create designs drivers and giving them feedback. And most recently, I worked on our COVID response projects. And a fun fact about me is that I was Lyft's first product design intern in 2017.
And we like to announce that a lot. Every time I have Yudi on a panel, like, Yudi was the first product design intern. And it's amazing to see how much the program has grown since then. So awesome. Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Gutierrez. I am a UX content strategist. I am the 4th UX content strategist at Lyft. We have a small but mighty team that's growing. I write and lead the content for our growth initiative, so on the writer side, so everything from coupons to just like new features we're building. And then I also write for the Lyft Pink membership product. Fun fact about me, I love pop culture. I love binging the latest thing on Netflix. I actually have the photographic memory, so I always remember a face. So I always love being like, ooh, where is that actor from? And then I look them up in Internet Movie Database and connect the dots. So I'm a pop culture nerd.
Awesome. I feel like during this time while we're inside, it's especially a good time to like really dive deep into that. Cool.
Totally.
Okay, and then Jeannie.
I'm Jeannie DeLoach. I'm a UX researcher here at Lyft, and I work on the customer care team. So anytime our riders and drivers have an issue and they go to the help section of the app, my team works on that, as well as we build the tools that let riders and drivers talk with our support associates. And fun fact about me, I, about a year ago, started trying to teach myself ukulele. I grew up in kind of a musical family, grew up singing, but this is my first instrument I'm trying to teach myself, and it's really fun. And it's fun to be really bad at something and just like starting from scratch and going through that.
Yeah. Although I feel like ukuleles, no matter how you play them, they sound great. Like I feel like I could just go like this and like, oh, it sounds like music.
Yeah, it's very beginner friendly, which I'm fortunate for.
Yay. Cool. So I think we're going to get started. Thanks everybody for introducing yourselves. And for students and attendees on the line, there is a chat feature here. If you have any questions, feel free to ask via the chat, and we'll try to monitor that as best as we can while we're talking. So we're going to start with talking a little bit about design at Lyft. And Lyft is a mid-sized company, I think, in comparison to other similarly like tech companies. So I get a lot of questions from students about what the design team is like, how it's structured. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about the day-to-day work of our designers and writers and researchers, and then we're going to segue after that to talk more about how you actually break into a design career. I posted on LinkedIn a while ago, and I saw lots of great questions come in, and those seem to be sort of like the 2 areas that most students wanted to hear about, so we're going to do our best to answer your questions. So I'd like to start off by asking Yudi to talk a little bit about how teams are built, design teams are built at Lyft, sort of the type of individuals that make up the team, like are there multiple researchers and designers and writers that make up a team? If you can talk about the Design Plus org.
So on our Design Plus org, which stands for like the team that encompasses our UX writers, our researchers, our DPMs, design program managers, and managers, there's around like 160 people. So it's like a fairly large Design Plus team. And then when we talk about our individual teams, we actually usually talk about our lines of business. So when I say that I'm on the driver team, it means that I work with around 7 other designers who also design for the overall driver experience. And with the 7 other designers, we have one small but mighty content strategist, like Stephanie said, and then we have around 2 UX researchers. So there's definitely, and there are writers and UX researchers, and that's because designers usually focus on a specific product. For example, I focus on driver excellence, which means driver education and driver feedback. And so I work with like a specific product team on that, but a content strategist, a UX writer, or a UX researcher might focus on multiple different product areas. And then if you have a slightly larger product area like driver earnings, you might actually have 1 or 2 designers on it, not just like a single designer.
Yeah. So it sounds like the work that everyone does on the Design Plus team can be very cross-functional, working with different product teams, sometimes developers. Can you all talk a little bit about what your typical workday looks like? We can start with Stephanie.
Yeah, typical workday. So I would say for UX writer, the job is very collaborative. So lots and lots of meetings. I feel like the best way to work is just like seeing what other designers have iterated on and then making sure that the content matches with that. Oh, sorry, my voice just cracked. So typically let's take a regular Monday. We have a check-in called stand up, and that's where everybody gives updates on what they're working on. I take notes, and since as Yudi mentioned, I support multiple teams, I understand like, okay, this week, this is gonna be the main priority for the business. And so I'm gonna prioritize that and set up time with that designer and understand what they're working on. And then, after a stand-up, there might be a crit in which people sign up to show their work and get feedback from other team members. And as you to attend those to give feedback on not only just like the specific grammar of the language, but also like the information that's being revealed to the user at different stages of the product. So crit's really important for collaboration and also just iterating as a UX writer. And then, just lots of one-on-ones. So stand-up, crit, one-on-ones. And then I make sure to block out focus time, where it's like an hour or 2 where I can just sit down, take all the information I got from those meetings and just be like, okay, now how am I going to translate this into the content strategy and what we write?
Cool. Jeannie, how does your day look?
Similar to Stephanie, it's UX research at Lyft. So I'm spending a lot of time also in meetings, talking with the UX writer on my team, designers, product managers, data scientists, to identify the main questions or highest impact problems spaces that we're working on the team, identifying opportunities for research, scoping that out, collaboratively running research, getting stakeholders involved, taking notes, observing sessions, even sometimes helping moderate sessions with users, and then analyzing data and reporting out to stakeholders. So as Yudi mentioned, researchers here are usually juggling a few different work streams at a time. And so I'll have projects in the scoping phase or in the wrap-up phase at the same time. And so in a typical day, I might be going to meetings where I'm planning out some research, and then later like moderating some interviews or checking survey results with users, and then trying to carve out a little bit of heads down time to dig deep on analysis and then report out.
Cool. And Yudi, did you want to add a little bit about what product designers do?
Yeah, I think Stephanie and Jeannie covered a lot of like the mutual roles that we share when we're working together. So a lot of like, if you're in the understanding phase of a product, you're probably working a lot with your UX researcher. And if you're in the refine or the explore phase, you're working a lot with your UX writer. I would say just like on top of that, there's usually like a cadence to my day. I'm probably more heads down, or I'm working one-on-one with people. And as a product or a design gets to be more finalized, that's when I start peppering in a lot of different reviews. Depending on what company you end up at, there's either like more or less of a review culture. And when we like think about the different types of reviews that you'll have to go through, they could be casual, like workshopping with one other person, or they could be like pretty high stakes, a leadership team review or an executive leadership team review. So all of my days basically lead towards like creating the end product, but like you have to segment everything so that like you have heads down time, and then you have review time, and then more heads down time until like you get to the very end.
For sharing that. And hopefully this provides students with a sense of just how different and varied everybody's day is, and why we have very defined roles for persons. And so this is something we'll get to later about maybe at a company where it's smaller and you're kind of doing all of this as a person wearing many multiple hats under design, versus at Lyft where Jeannie and Yudi and Stephanie have very different roles, like some similarities but different roles. Can you all also, because I think students are always asking, like, what tools should I know? Top 3 tools that each of you use in your day. We'll start with Jeannie, or technologies.
Sure. Top 3. I think for running remote research interviews, we use GoToMeeting a lot, or Zoom. I also like to use Optimal Workshop to do like remote card sorting really easily, or to just easily have a record of card sorting when I'm testing with folks in person. And then a lot of the prototypes that we test are now through Figma as well. So I think those are top 3.
Cool. What about you, Yudi? What are the tools you use?
Switch to Figma as a design team. So that's like where I designs and like collaborate with Stephanie and Jeannie. There's also Principal, which is like my poison of choice when it comes to prototyping. So like that's how I bring the designs to life and like ideally feed research study. And I would also say like Google Slides. Like we do a lot of presentations here, so I'm almost always on a.
Yeah, same here. What about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, with +1, what y'all have said. So I'm just going to lump in the G Suite together, Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Google Slides, because that's really important for collaboration. Figma +1, I'm a huge Figma fan. It makes it a lot easier to comment on the designs and give content recommendations. I'm also going to throw Slack in there. I'm new to Slack, and there was a steep learning curve, but it's really important because so much of the company's updates and information gets shared through there. So just like becoming an expert in that.
We also have a great set of emojis. I feel like a very, very good set of emojis. I love it too. Cool. And I think we might have 1 or 2 questions about just creative process. Yudi, can you talk a little bit about how Lyft approaches design and design systems, and what kind of decisions and approaches are taken?
So when I was an intern in 20, actually creating our design system for the first time. So if you're in a earlier stage, the questions that you'll be working with are usually like, what units of measurement do we want our design system to be? Like, should it be a 4-point design system or an 8-point design system? And then you're usually like auditing the existing experience to see which features like need to be made into like design system component. Like here's a button that's a component in the design system. Today, like now that our design system is a lot more mature, usually the work that goes into the design system is about, you know, when you first start a project, you take the general idea that you're looking for and you try to plug in pre-existing components that are already made. And then what I would usually do is like take a step back and ask myself, like, of the pre-existing components that I use, like, are there any that are actually not serving a purpose or like not working well for this design? And if you find yourself in that position, then that's when you might create a new component for the design system. And then you would socialize that back to the system. So you go to the design systems team, show them your new idea. And then ideally over time, they would see more use cases similar to yours, in which case they would add that back into the design.
Oh, thank you. And then related to like processes, Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about how writing is a part of the design process, and maybe also touch on the idea of collaboration and what that looks like between the different types of persons in Design Plus?
Yeah, totally. So I would say when it comes to collaborating between content strategists and UX designers, the best thing to do is to include the content strategist early on. At the beginning, at the inception of a new product, like the content strategist can provide insight into the layout of the information. So like what's the hierarchy of what the user reads, in what order, what information do they need to know when, like what are you deciding to name things and things like that. And those I would say are all early phase decisions. So yeah, so looping in your content strategist and your UX researcher early on so they can identify like what are the questions that need to be answered, and also like what are the content constraints and content considerations that need to be accounted for. So the best way to do that is through a kickoff meeting. You know, treat your content strategist and UX researcher as like a true partner. We're first and foremost design practitioners. I always tell people I'm a design practitioner first and a writer second. I look at things holistically. I'm not a copy editor. Please don't call me a copywriter. That's like an important distinction. But yeah, so just like as you would collaborate with any other partner, giving them regular updates, iterating with them. I know a lot of designers will host like brainstorms in which they'll use the Post-its, and they include, partners from all over, from product and also from content strategy and UXR to get their input on new features. So that's a good way to include us in the creative process. Does that answer your question?
I think we hit on a lot of things that we'll talk about later, as well as to like things that we look for in resumes or portfolios that are specific to UX writing, for example. So not just copy editor, right? So we'll segue and talk a little bit about skills building. We had a lot of questions coming in from students about how do I gain the skills that I need to be a UX researcher or a writer. So I'll have Jeannie kick it off. For somebody who doesn't have a design background, like maybe a student pivoting into the field or career changer, what do they need to do to grow their UX research skill set? What are the things that they should be building?
Yeah, I love this question. I actually came from a non-design background as well. I got a liberal arts degree in English and tried working in law and advertising before I found my way into UX research. So based on my experience and a lot of other career switchers I've met along the way, if you're still a student, definitely look at taking design-related courses at your school. But if you've graduated, there are also a ton of resources available for free online, a ton of different blogs and articles, as well as like Udacity has a really excellent product design course that goes into product as well as like the research process. And I found that super helpful. And then once you've started to get your feet wet with these basic skills, I recommend you start learning by doing. So to build up your self-confidence and start honing those skills, like pick a website or app that you think could be improved and do a concept redesign. Identify what the problems are you think with it. If you're trying to build your research skill set, run some usability tests with people around campus or in a coffee shop to get that data, and then make improvements. And then you can volunteer your time with startups as well. If you're a student, again, a lot of times they're on campus groups like student startups that you can be the writer, designer, researcher for. They are really hungry to get help with these sorts of things, and you can lend your skills to them. You can also volunteer with organizations online or in your community. The thing that I try to encourage folks who are just starting out in any career is the most important thing to you early on is getting experience. So don't feel bad about volunteering your time. You're accumulating things to put in your portfolio and continuing to build your skills.
Yeah, I love all the concrete steps you've given, and these are, I think, great action steps for students. And I've often gotten the question like, oh, what should I put on my resume or my portfolio? When you said like redoing a concept for something that's already been created, that's like a very meaty thing that they can put. So thanks for all of that. Yudi or Stephanie, do either one of you have thoughts on specific skills for writers or product designers to know?
Yeah, I would say for writers, clear writing, simpler is better. So just thinking about examples in your past where you've like had to explain something to someone, whether it was through an email or, through a project or something for school. So thinking about how did you communicate it? What were the most important pieces of information you had to give that person? And like, how did you structure it? I know when I first got started in content strategy, like I came from sales. I had a very non-traditional background. I was a communication journalism major, but working in sales, I had to explain products to clients a lot. And so I actually used those client emails as like my first portfolio pieces. And it was, a non-traditional thing, but it touched on the tenets of content strategy, which is taking very complicated ideas and simplifying them for your audience and your user. So I would say that is like the foundation, and then just like building up your collaboration skills, because so much of the job is like working with other people, communicating your ideas and your point of view, and being able to like defend why you're recommending something.
Love it. Yudi, do you have anything else to add for product designers specifically?
I think just like Jeannie said, the like redesign is a really good approach. And that's because like if you're choosing a pre-existing product to redesign, they already have a design system. So it means that like you're not the one who has to like spin out of scratch like an entirely new visual design for like the successful product that you know like somebody else has already tested and it works in that way. I would also say that like even if you're entirely new to product design, but you're coming from like a different industry, there's like a very small part of my everyday job is creating visual designs, and an even bigger part of my everyday job is just collaborating with other people, communication skills, product management thinking. And so if you feel like you already have some of those skills from your prior experience, you shouldn't be shy to bring those to the table and like communicate how like those skills would also transfer. Because I would say like the visual design is actually the easier part to teach, and the harder part is like retraining yourself to communicate or to collaborate.
Yeah, totally. Great. Thank you for all the great answers and very helpful, actionable advice. We have a question that's come in a lot about figuring out which UX vertical is best suited for you. I think that, you know, sometimes at smaller companies, you're doing everything. At larger companies, you're more defined in what you are doing. And so in thinking about like your first job out of school and figuring out like which of those you'd be best at, like, do you have any general advice? And we can start with Jeannie about figuring out the best vertical for yourself.
Yeah, I think that it's personal choice in terms of whether or not you want to go to one of those smaller companies like Vivian mentioned that will ask you to do writing and design and research all in one, and that'll give you an opportunity to practice your skills in all three and see which you're gravitating toward more. Or if you want to pick one at a medium or larger company like Lyft or larger, and start specializing and see if it's the right fit. As you're thinking through it, a helpful model for me that I'd recommend you think about is cultivating a T-shaped skill set. So think about like the capital. There's a lot of breadth within UX and technology and product development, and being aware of and being able to dabble in these different skills is really valuable. But ultimately, you do want to be cultivating kind of a deep expertise in something. So even folks who are career-long UX generalists do tend to be leaning slightly more toward design or writing or research in their expertise. And so just starting to think about that model early on will, I think, make you more versatile and allow you to go into a specialty later on if you want to.
And I see that even for a lot of students now where they do have that breadth, but then they've managed to find out and dive more into a specific specialty. And then those are the resumes that often stand out for a particular internship, is when they've like cultivated specific like UX research skills in the context of having general design skills. Great. And then I also wanted to go back to something that Stephanie mentioned about, you pivoted from working in sales and you kind of touched on transferable skills. Can you talk about how you, other strategies for translating transferable skills that you may have gained in other jobs that don't necessarily directly correlate with UX tasks, such as writing for social media blogs, whatnot, any other advice you have, because I think students are coming from different non-design backgrounds, and that would be helpful.
Yeah, totally. So when I was in sales and I knew that like sales wasn't for me, the first thing I started doing was a lot of coffee chats and informational interviews where I found somebody who was doing a job that I was interested in. I came up with a bunch of questions and I went into it just to learn about their career, no agenda, no request for a job, just wanting to learn like how they got to where they got. And I used all the insights I got from those chats just to be like, does this match up with my personality and like my skill sets, and like using that as a way to like narrow in where I would ultimately want to end up. And I think knowing where you want to land, it makes it easy to connect the dots to where you're currently at. So like after talking to those people, I was able to be like, okay, clear communication, that's important. When do I clearly communicate in my current role? How can I turn these into examples, into portfolio pieces, but also answers to questions in an interview? Like how would I frame working with a client as a content strategy skill set. And so just having that understanding with those info chats. And I would also say just like understanding your strengths as well. There are strengths that are good across all jobs, as Yudi was mentioning, like clear communication and collaboration is so essential. You could be the best designer, but if you can't collaborate, you're really only going to go so far. So when I graduated college, I took the Strengths Finder quiz to understand like what my strengths were. And that's a good way to just kind of like be like, okay, this is what I'm good at. Let's focus on that, especially when it comes to interviews, and how do I connect that to the roles I want.
Strengths finders as well. I think it's like great to be self-aware in that space, and then to have that help guide you. It's one of the factors in figuring out what career you're interested in. Great. So I think at this point we're going to segue into some more resume and interviewing tips. We always get lots and lots of questions in this realm, and I'll kick off the section on resume review and portfolio review from a recruiter's perspective. I think it's different at each company, whether a recruiter sort of looks at resumes and portfolios and then passes students on to interviews versus other companies that maybe have a hiring manager be more involved in the initial screens. For myself, I'm one of the university recruiters at Lyft, and I focus on specifically design, or that's one of my focuses. And so for the initial screening, I do a lot of that. Sometimes I'll talk with hiring managers about the initial students that I'm seeing in the initial phase, but by and large, I'm essentially like a gatekeeper, right? I think recruiters are often seen as that. So wanted to talk a little bit about some things that I look for in resumes and portfolios. So we'll start with resumes. So with resumes, I think even before sort of like, when students are like, what should I put on my resume? And like, how should my resume look? I think even before thinking about that, take a step back and think about like projects, right? And think about like the actual work that you're going to put on your resume, because number one, it'll help you as you're going through a project, as you're doing a project, figure out like, is this work that I actually enjoy, right? It'll help you really further flesh out your career and like what sort of vertical you're interested in. And maybe you might decide after doing projects that actually, I don't like design. I want to do something else. Like maybe the developer part of it is something that calls to me. So number one, it'll help you figure out. Number two, as you're doing these projects, you'll work on those collaboration skills and communication skills if you're working with other people. That's definitely just alluded to. It's a key part of working at any company. And then you're also going to have that piece for your portfolio. So I think that even before, for your portfolio and your resume. So I think even before putting together your resume, intentionally seek out projects, group project as well as individual projects to put on your resume. As far as the actual resume, each resume that you use for a different job should look tailored to that job. So I think doing research on whether this position at a smaller startup requires you to be everything versus at Lyft, when we hire interns, as an example, a UX research intern resume is going to look very different than a UX writer resume, and it's going to look different from a product design resume. So I can go more into each of those. So for a product design resume, projects and past internships, if you have those that are product design specific, visual interaction design skills, a portfolio is a must for product design internships. So when I look at the portfolio, which I'll talk into more later, I am looking for specific design projects. And then for UX research resume, it is very different than a product design resume. I think that sometimes very often I see students who apply to both jobs and they have the exact same resume, but in a research resume, I'm really more looking for specific like quantitative and qualitative skills. So students will often put different projects or past internships or research assistantships where they're doing things like card sorting and focus groups and surveys and using various quantitative methods. And so those are the specific things that I'm looking for. And then in a UX writing resume, I think it's oftentimes a blend of design and writing. And that can come from many different pieces. And I think probably out of all three verticals, UX writing, I feel like people are coming from the most different kinds of backgrounds. So I think it's that blend of writing and design. And then if we segue into portfolios for each of those three. So for product design portfolios, and Yudi, feel free to chime in because I learned a lot about product design portfolios. from you. I usually look for a couple of design projects or past internship descriptions, usually 3 or 4, just so that I can get enough signal. I think design process is one of the main things that I look for in a product design portfolio. So, oftentimes if you look at other students' portfolios, and you look at a case study, it's probably gone through like, here's the problem, this is the research that I did, this is who I talked to, these are the personas, this is what my initial mock-ups look like, this is what my prototypes look like, and then the best portfolios I've seen also go very clearly into rationale for like why they made certain design choices, like, and maybe they're illustrating that by putting like a little bubble next to a certain feature in the prototype as to why they chose that, and like sort of explain your design decisions. So it's both the process and the rationale. And then through that, I also get an indication of your visual skills as well as your interaction design skills, like your flows. And of course, I'm not a designer, right? So I'm not gonna like go nitpicking in there. I'm just doing an initial screen, and then the designer will be the one to go deeper at that interview stage. So those are just some things to keep in mind for design portfolios. For user research, I don't think that a portfolio is necessary. If you have one, great, but it's not necessary. I think that if a resume has all those skills that I mentioned before, then that for me is enough. So not as necessary for me to have like a UX research portfolio. And then for writing, I do ask for a portfolio. I want to see writing samples. And I think similar to a design portfolio where people are explaining their different writing choices, that's helpful. What is less ideal is when I get writing samples and it's like this like 20-page scientific piece. So that's not necessarily going to give me a good gauge of like your short form writing, maybe that's like in a more designy context. So those are just some things that I look for in resumes and portfolios. Yudi, Jeannie, or Stephanie, any other things that you would call out as designers and writers and researchers?
I think you covered it all. I would just say the why is so important. So I personally think it's better to have like less examples that are really good than like 10 examples, And when you add those examples, consider things like, what was the scenario? Who did I collaborate with? What did I own in the writing? And was there another writer, and what did they own? What were the considerations and constraints I was working under? Like, was there like something I couldn't change that I just had to incorporate into my work? Like, explain, as you said, the process and like what you were writing around, what you were considering, and then kind of like, what was your solution? And like, better yet, if you can have some like success story with it, like, oh, we got 10 more signups on our app because of this change I made. Like, that's a really compelling story, and it speaks to the collaboration, to your strategy, and also
definitely
like your
storytelling, impact, collaboration, super important. And I think Yudi, you may have mentioned this like to me way back when. It's like not necessarily like I did this and then I did this and then I did this, but like more going deeply into that. So, cool.
I think you generally want to explain like your product, want to explain the end design, right? Because anybody who's looking at it can tell what it looks like, but they don't necessarily know the trade-offs that you had to make to get there. One other thing a lot of the times when you don't have that many projects, you're tempted to put everything that you have on your portfolio, but oftentimes you want to be kind of tactical about exactly what you list. If you feel like a project doesn't represent your best work, you shouldn't have it on your portfolio just to have more work, because it will like invariably make people doubt like whether or not this is your usual work or whether or not the best foot you put forward is your usual work. So you want to be tactical about like really putting like the creme of the crop on your projects.
Yeah. Cool. And I think on that note, I wanted to call out a question that somebody asked just now. Niharika Matur asked, I know various people whose internships were canceled this summer due to the virus. How would you think this would affect the way you look at portfolios next year? Is that something the recruiters are likely to keep in mind while recruiting for full-time next year? Yes, I think everybody is very mindful of the fact that people were unfortunately very impacted and lost opportunities. I think that in terms of like looking at portfolios and resumes, I love projects. I don't think it's necessary to have an internship, and it's certainly not a requirement to when you're applying for an internship, it's not a requirement to have done another internship. And so when I look at a portfolio, having 3-4 plus projects speaks volumes about your dedication to the work and your commitment to doing the work. And so oftentimes I find that projects actually show even more than like an internship write-up in a portfolio, because I've often found that like for internship write-ups, it's like it's very sparse because you can't really go into too much detail because NDA is limiting what you can speak to it. So it's actually not, so I like skip past it. I'm like, okay, this person did an internship. They can perform in this industry space. So that's like a good signal. But in terms of like actually seeing for myself, your ability to do visual and interaction work, whatnot, I look more to your projects. So I would say continue to work on those projects, and those can be done right individually with your friends and use those in your portfolio. And I think recruiters are very cognizant of sort of the realities of the market. Cool. And then I think we're going to segue into talking a little bit about interviewing. We get a lot of questions about what am I being assessed for in this interview? What do I need to show to be successful? And we have different interview loops for each of the different verticals at Lyft because everybody does have very defined roles. We do hire for product designers and UX researchers and writers separately. So I wanted to go through each of them with each of our panelists to talk about what they look for. And Yudi, Jeannie, and Stephanie have done a ton of intern interviews in the past couple of years, so they are the best people to speak to it. Like I mentioned, Yudi helped me with ramping up on design interviewing a couple of years ago. Jeannie was one of our hiring managers for UX research interns this year, so she's like very much in that world of intern recruiting and just interviewing. And Stephanie was involved in hiring our first ever UX research intern this season. Yay, cool. So start with Yudi. So for product design interviews, we usually start with a phone screen, right? And if a person passes a phone screen, then they go to a final interview, which generally consists of a presentation and a design challenge of sorts, past work, and a critique. So can you talk about sort of what you look for in generally, and maybe like a little bit of each?
Yeah, definitely. I think usually what you're looking for is like this person's ability to deliver on like a project and like overcome challenges. So if I was the candidate, then I would be like trying to tell a story, like a really compelling story of like, here's like all of the different things that I had to work with, and like here are all of the different challenges that I overcame, and here's like what you should think about me as a result of like me telling you the story, right? And so I think in order to deliver successfully on that, there are like a few key techniques. Like one is like yourself to like talking in depth about a challenge. Usually when I see on-sites, I never see more than 2 projects, if that. So like sometimes you might choose to focus on a single project. What that also means is like in the phone screen, you'll see like a person who won't necessarily be in your on-site. And so like what you want to do in your phone screen is like you can feel guns and like show your best project there, because you won't have a repeat of that same person in your on-site, unless it's like a really small team, in which case you might. I think another thing that's really important that I don't feel like I see enough of is like clearly establishing what your role was on the project. And some people do this by saying like, oh, I was like the lead designer on like X, Y, and Z. But if I knew that you were the lead designer on this project in the context of an internship, then I would also want to know like exactly what kind of working relationship you had with like the more senior designers who were like inevitably on your team, right? So like, how did you collaborate with the other senior designers? How did you get feedback from them? And I would say like that's almost sometimes more important to me than like how much autonomy you had, especially if we're hiring for a new grad internship role, because I'm more concerned about like how you'll work against feedback than how you'll work on your own, because that's not the goal of the internship. I think one more thing is just like, especially if it's a new grad role, you might be applying to pretty specific jobs. So for example, I might be applying to like a design growth job. So like I'm a designer on a growth team, in which case like you should try to make yourself aware of like what different circumstances that new role requires. For example, like some teams might ask for like a person who's stronger in visual design. some teams might ask for a person who's stronger in product thinking, and you want to tailor your presentation and the things you say during your interview to the role that you're applying for. This is less relevant to internships, which tend to be more general. But if you're aiming for a new grad role, you want to like tailor your application.
Do you have any specific advice on like a critique interview or a design challenge, like best ways to show up in those interviews?
Those are like really interesting because not all companies do them differently. There are like a lot of really good case studies on how to do a critique interview. So I'll let you guys all read that. What I will say about critiques is like, it really depends on like what kind of thinking style you are. Like if you feel like you're able to talk out really clear while you're doing it, then you should go for it. If you feel like you need to take a moment and like quietly sit with yourself before you say something, then you should do that. Like a lot of the advice that I see around critiques is to like always talk aloud. And what I find is that sometimes it's actually a little bit confusing if I'm hearing the candidate's like immediate train of thought, because I don't know which are the pieces that they want to like present to me and like have stand out. And then on the other hand, for the design challenges, I think the biggest and most important thing is always just gathering all of your information up front. So you want to know like exactly who your users are, what the market is, like what the opportunity is, why they're having you design this, and like set off into the distance and like, you know, horses racing with like your like creative ideas. If you don't gather that information well enough up front, it indicates to me that maybe you're not thinking about it. And then when we come to it later down the road, it means that you might have to redo some of the work that you already did in the challenge.
Yeah. Thanks for that advice. I think that like very actionable, specific advice that students can help apply to their interviews. And then Jeannie, for UX research interviews, at least at Lyft, in terms of what the flow is, right? So again, starting with the phone screen, and then if the student passes the phone screen, then there's a final like on-site, usually virtual, and then that final loop looks like a presentation, and there's a methods and skills section, there's an analytical critical thinking section, and we usually also have a collaboration and teamwork piece. For you, I think you've seen all those interviews and conducted, I think, all of them. Do you have any general advice and specific ones for any or all?
Yeah, definitely. So +1 to everything that Yudi said about how to pick which stories to tell, which case studies to highlight in the phone screen and the final presentation. +1 to everything she said about clarifying like what your role is, who the team was, showcasing how you collaborated with other folks. I think especially in research where portfolios are not quite as common, critical in the phone screen and in the final presentation that you do that same storytelling that Stephanie and Yudi were talking about. And there are like 5 pieces that I always expect to hear in any research story. So first, like, what was the problem? Who identified the problem? How did you or your manager or stakeholder decide this was the problem you were going to focus on? And then what method did you use in order to start addressing that problem or digging into that problem space? I'm not looking for you to be an expert in every method, but I am expecting folks even early on to understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative methodologies and understanding why the method that they chose was the right method to answer the research question they had. And then I want to understand, like, how did the research go? I don't need you to tell me all of your research findings, but pick like 1 or 2 to give me a taste of how the research went and that are relevant to the story that you're trying to tell me. And then the 4th piece is analysis. So once you actually did your research, how did you go about figuring out what the key takeaways were? Again, I'm not expecting you to have expertise in all methods of analysis. I'm just mostly looking to understand what your process is and ensuring that you are kind of a systematic thinker, that there's some rhyme to your reason to your rhyme. And then lastly, I want to know what the impact is. Ideally, you're not doing research in a vacuum. And so I want to know, did you convince a difficult stakeholder of something they weren't they weren't on board with before, or did the design change in some way. I expect in the phone screen to like still hear all those pieces, but it's more condensed. And then in the final, sorry, there's a dog barking. In the final presentation, that's more blown out. And then the last thing I'll say for research that's really important to highlight throughout is I'm trying to evaluate whether or not you're empathetic. Like our job as researchers is to champion the people using our product. And I need to hear that you're really excited about the people you spoke to or surveyed. And yeah, you have to convince me that you're really excited about being their champion throughout the product process.
Is key, I think, across all design discipline. I found that, sorry about that. Found that to be true across all design. Thank you, Jeannie. And then finally, Stephanie, in terms of UX writing process, so we usually start out with a phone screen and there is a written writing exercise to really see, like when given a UX writing challenge, how the student or the candidate will respond or address that. And then there's a final interview, which is generally a combination of like collaboration skills and UX writing. I think, Stephanie, you've probably been part of each of those. Can you talk about your thoughts as to how to best ace an interview or writing challenge?
Yeah, totally. And +1 to everything Jeannie and Yudi have already said. I think those things, like those learnings apply to UX writing interviews as well. I'll say for the phone screener and just like all the interviews in general, when you're answering a question, even if it's not a question that's specifically asking for an example from you from your past experience, always like somehow tie in a specific example, like, and it doesn't have to be 100% related to UX. It could be like, this one time when I was working on a group project for this class, this is the problem we encountered and this is how I handled it. So just always having like a list of past experience examples that you can tie into different questions and answers, so I can understand like, oh, this is how this person tackles this in their past experiences. I think a specific answer is always more compelling than just like a general, like, I think clear writing is great, but it's like, when did you see bad writing? And to that point, also make a list of screens, whether it's in the Lyft app or just apps in general, that you think have really good UX writing. That's always a question that's going to come up, is like, tell me about good UX writing. And like, why was it good? And then also, like, on the flip side, bad UX writing. When was something you saw that was just not great, and how would you have fixed it? And just always having that list on the back burner that you can pull into the interview. And I would say something that's just as important as your answers is your questions. You know, what are the types of questions you're asking me? Have you done your research in this area? Do you know what the company's mission is? Like, what are the questions you ask when I give you a problem to solve through in an interview? Like, that shows me your thinking process, and that shows me how you problem solve, and that's really critical. So like, even if it's like 2 questions that you always come up with, like, you know, what do you like, what's one thing Lyft's trying to solve for in the next year, or like something like that, is a great way to end the interview. In terms of the writing exercise, most companies will have a writing exercise, whether it's for a UX writing team, a help center writing team, or a marketing writing team. It's a good way to see, like, you know, without all the time in the world to polish, like, what is your gut reaction in terms of like what you would write. And in those instances, just like the portfolio, the why and the explanation is so much more important than the specific words you pick. Like, why did you recommend this? What are the questions you asked yourself? What thought process? Like, really take me into your thought process, because that's what I want to see. And I would just say, this applies to interviews in general. Do your research on the company. You know, set up a Google alert for the company you're interested in. What's happening in the news for that company? What's their mission? What are the values they stand up? What were the last tweets they gave? Like, really be invested in that, because ultimately a design team is a subset of a business. And at the end of the day, you're going to be designing things that are in service of the business and growing the platform. So thinking about that is really important.
And then I also wanted to ask all of you, in terms of students wanting to get a sense beyond the actual project work, beyond the actual technical work, they want to get a sense of the company's culture when they're talking to all of you as interviewers. How should they go about doing that? Like, what are some good questions to ask to learn about whether the design team's culture is a good fit for them? And anybody can answer.
I can jump in. To Stephanie's point, like it's really important the questions that you ask, and always remember you're interviewing this company as much as they're interviewing you. You have a choice whether or not to work there. And so, yeah, asking questions to dig into culture are really valuable. I've learned that there are a couple questions I try to ask anywhere I interview that are particularly revealing. So I always ask it. It feels like a softball question, but what's your favorite thing about working here? Who I work with is extremely important to me, and so I'm looking for them to rave about their coworkers. Like if you can tell if folks are excited about the people that they work with or not. I also like to ask like how folks have worked with researchers in the past. I'm looking for designers and product managers to have some familiarity or excitement about learning to work with research, as well as an interest in collaborating really closely, because that's how I like to work. And yeah, so what do you like about working here? How have you liked to work with research? Oh, and then like how do you feel, what do you think that success looks like for the person coming into this role in the first month, 6 months, year, whatever, just to get a sense of, are they looking for the person in this role, this researcher, to be digging into strategic questions or more usability questions? Like what are the things that how do they think that UXR is going to work on their team? And are those the kind of problems that I'm interested in solving?
I definitely like students like taking this as an opportunity to see if this company's culture and the work that they do is in alignment with you. I think that oftentimes we may feel as candidates like, oh, I have to like prove myself or whatnot, but then the company has to prove itself to you. I saw a couple of questions on the chat, and this is something that, you know, we had discussed earlier amongst the panelists about COVID. I think that's sort of like an elephant in the room of, you know, there are lots of layoffs happening across the world in tech, including, I think nobody is immune to it. And I saw some questions about, okay, does it feel like the market is saturated with more people who want the same jobs and there's fewer roles? Any thoughts on that? Advice? I think I've seen questions about like companies who are looking for, during COVID times, more senior designers or researchers, and less so people who are starting out in the industry. Any advice or thoughts about that?
I would say one of the positives that's coming out of COVID is the ability to work from anywhere. So if you weren't previously in a big hub like San Francisco, because of everything that's going on, you now have an opportunity to do a San Francisco tech job from Georgia, from where you are. And even though there are layoffs, like doing your homework into the business of like, what are the companies that are actually thriving right now? Like, you know, enterprise software, like virtual whiteboards, like there's tons of companies that focus in these areas that are hiring and have the resources right now. So just like being smart about where you apply, probably something in the travel sector, not a good time to go that route. So I would say the silver lining is work from anywhere is now becoming a trend.
I would say also double down on the project. I mean, these are things that can be done outside of like official like employment or company work. So I think that as you're building your skills, to continue to do that. The courses that were mentioned, Udemy, Coursera, there are product design, UX research, whatnot courses. So I think there's still always opportunities to build your skills, even in the absence of official employment. Something that I've also seen a lot is on LinkedIn. A lot of people, once they have been laid off, have been sharing their stories and their skills in public posts. Like, I was impacted recently by this reduction in force. I'm a product designer with this many years. I've loved working at blah, blah, blah. And then I've seen the response to that, which has been really overwhelming. And I know people who've been laid off and then found a job pretty quickly. So I think don't be afraid to advocate for yourself, to sell yourself in these public forums. I mean, everybody has a different level of comfort with how much they want to put themselves out there. But I've seen people do that to high levels of success because people want to help. I think that when, you know, as human beings, you know, you see somebody impacted, negatively because of what's happened, and you want to do what you can to help them. So I would say to advocate for yourself. I'm gonna see if Kathleen is back here.
I think we're at time. We have 1 minute left, but we're at time. Team for joining us. We had a lot of people on, 240 viewers. So this is exciting. Great, insightful questions to everyone on the chat. A few things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send out a email with a survey. And if you guys want to submit your resume and information, I'm going to be sending that over to Vivian. And then also the winner for a resume review with Corey, who is actually the head of UR at Lyft, is Alex Wynn. So we'll definitely be emailing you. Congratulations. And we have our next session next week with Roblox. The VP of Engineering from Roblox will be doing a session as well. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this was insightful. Again, let's give it up for the Lyft team. If you guys can just hashtag Lyft in the chat. And I'm very grateful to you guys. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.